I 4-0'd with Miracles. Zach got a job.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
Before we get started, I want to give a quick thanks and appreciation out there to all the Durdle Maniacs that support us on Patreon. Without these people, the podcast could not afford the production upgrades and time we devote to it. If you appreciate the content we create, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/EternalDurdles. Now on to the show.
Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, did you want to say that part? Because you got the bigger news, actually. You 4-0'd.
Yeah, I 4-0'd a local with Beanstalk Miracles, like in a way that's not 4-color Euro grind pile Miracles. Actual
it looked like a Miracles list. I checked it out. That's a Miracles list with beans.
Yeah, it is one of those things. Like I had tried really, really hard to stay away from stuff that like had crossed over with 4-color because I didn't want to become a worse version of that. But what I ended up doing over time, and the thing is I iterate in paper. I don't really like to iterate online. I find that like playing online, I just find like every time I try and play online for an extended period of time to test that's not for a major tournament, like testing now for EW makes sense, right? You want to get in some reps. But like when it comes to something like when I find when playing a deck like Miracles, where the top of the libraries and that those zones really matter, dexterity really matters. Yeah. And so if you're not practicing the dexterity, you sort of are still losing some points because you might, I've done it even to this day, a decade in, where you like fail to reveal your miracle terminus, which, Moto does for you. Yeah. But if you don't practice doing it yourself, then you just get clipped.
I think that's an important aspect of transferring from digital to paper is missing those triggers, remembering the top cards of your library, stuff like that, stuff that you can easily do on in a digital format that you lose something when you move. If you only do that, you lose something when you move into paper.
That's I find. One thing that I'll be doing with testing is, this week I'm going to meet up with a friend of mine named Jared, who we're going to, we literally using metadeck.me, which I know we plugged on the cast before, which, we're just going to build the gauntlet of the metagame we expect, and we're going to jam them in paper with the decks that we want to play. We're just going to run our decks through the gauntlet. And, that may not be necessarily as efficient as Moto, because you can't, play at, midnight or 1 a.m. or whatever when you're up. But you do get the advantage of dexterity purposes, like understanding how long everything takes in terms of like fetching and clock management. Like that stuff really matters, particularly if you're playing a long game control deck. So I find that those are more, maybe not at first glance, but those are actually really positive testing experiences where you can actually use the cards in your hand to make sure that you're playing fast enough, make sure that your dexterity is on point, and make sure that you can do all of that while also playing tight. So, but that is to say, yes, I played Beans in a Miracle Shell. It was essentially Bant Miracles. I splashed. I had a light splash, which I'm still up in the air about, but Prismatic Ending really incentivizes you to be able to go up to 4 because the One Ring exists, and other haymakers exist. Like Karn is still in the format, right? Sometimes if you're playing against Mono Black Helm, you want to be able to shut off the ley line of the void so they can't just combo you with a beseech. Like there's incidental things where going up to 4 is really important. And so I think that like having your, going up to your 4th color after you've ensured that you have enough color requisites to provide everything else in your deck, that, Prismatic Ending incentivizes that. And then Beanstalk just, makes your X spells hard mode for your opponent, because you can just max it out and draw a bunch of cards. Which comes up a bunch when you're just trading,
Phil, I have a question, and I don't want to put him on the spot, but did you happen to be on 90s MTG last night?
Yeah, all 4 of my matches are going to be on 90s.
Dude,
when they come out.
We can say it, Phil. Roll that beautiful bean footage.
Yeah, it is one of those things. Like it's the first time that I've done well at a local event in a long time, trying out a bunch of different technology, and ultimately what I found was that the power creep and the snowballing of new cards is such that the other stuff can't keep up. Like I was a predict gamer for a really long time, and all of the cards that are only cards that generate raw cards but don't do anything else have been really pushed out by the stuff that draws cards plus does other things, whether that's
Yeah.
attack and block, whether that's provides you some kind of, combo incentive, whether it's, that plus an additional tutor or threat of some kind. And the difference between something like Predict and Beanstalk or Ring or whatever is that those cards are engines, where Predict is not.
Well, that's the thing is, like, let's just look at it from a worst case scenario, right? On both ends. Beanstalk and Predict are almost the same card in a worst case scenario, right? In a best case scenario, you're drawing 3, 4, 5 times as many cards with Beanstalk.
Well, yes, 100%. It's a combination of, like, yes, the Beanstalk is just, like, way more powerful than any raw card advantage spell. But the other side of it, though, is that because it's not a one-off.
And it's exponential,
It compels you. It becomes the battleground on which your opponent has to play, right? Like, if they choose to ignore the Beanstalk, they'll lose to it. It's like if they're not going over the top of it, or they're not meeting it at parity with their own engine, or using all of their resources to try and turn it off, then it just buries them. So it's not only something that generates all of the raw cards, and that's what I mean by it does something plus something else. It's like the second that it enters the battlefield and replaces itself, meaning it's the opportunity cost of it is nothing because it replaces itself. It's just like really, really placid design in my mind. Even though, like, I just did really well with it, and I'm probably going to play it at EU, right? It's just like I was talking about how, like, a long time ago, the only real card that felt this way was Baleful Strix, in that when you cast it, if your opponent did anything to interact with it, you were like, this is great. And then if they didn't do anything to interact with it, you were like, this is great.
I love drawing cards. I love taking cards out of my opponent's hand for no reason.
Yeah, the opportunity cost of it was so low because it cantripped that the initial investment was all you needed to do, and then the rest of it was whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's like any amount of interaction with this piece that I have on the table now that has given me the card back doesn't matter. And so, like, every other version of Beanstalk has been like, the 3 mana, if you control a creature with 4 or greater, or whenever a creature ETBs that has a power, whatever, you draw a card, or like maybe it ETBs, and if you have a condition met, you replace itself. But those are all at like 3 mana plus. It's the first time they've ever done it at 2 mana, and the first time at 2 mana where it replaces itself as a default.
Yeah.
No condition needs to be met, no prerequisite. You just slam it on 2, and then it dictates the play for the rest of the game. It's really, really boring, but it's also really, really powerful. And so, like, I found the games where it just becomes those arm race games, those are real. From playing them, they're probably fun to watch because stuff happens. But when you play them, they're actually really boring. It just becomes about those engines back and forth. But there is something to be said about positioning against those decks. So in the 4-color mirrors, right, it's the arms race. I need more Beanstalks. I need more Run Rings. I just need more stuff, right? We got to keep up with each other because we're just going to be free-rolling back and forth free spells. And so the games either become about who has more of the engine pieces or who has more Force of Wills. And that's it. Those are the metrics that the game rests upon. Maybe you get at some point deep in the game, if somebody has an engine, you can, jam through a 4th for lethal if that are at a relatively low life total. But, like, that's a negligible portion of games. So you either are in that arms race and you're trying to figure that out, and then you're going to concede some amount of, like, equity to fast combo, and you're trying to thread the needle of how much do you want to be able to beat Urza Saga and fast combo versus how much do you want to be able to keep up with the arms race in the 4-color control mirrors. So that's where the avenue splits. What I decided to do is, because I hate Uro and I hate tap out, expensive cards. So I hated playing 4-color when I tried it. So I took the cheap part and the good part of those 4-color decks, which is Beanstalk. And then I just took all of the technology that I've been working on for however long in Miracles, which is just a bunch of Mystic Sanctuaries and Thwarts. And turns out that when you Mystic Sanctuary your Force Will back to the top after it's already replaced itself, and then it just continues to replace itself, now you have this, like, ongoing engine that can never happen.
Yeah.
And everybody was always like, well, you have to play Yorion 80 card because the threat of decking yourself in those types of games with Beanstalk, because it's not a May, is really can happen, is a likelihood, right? Like, you can deck. And for the longest time, I've always been like, man, if I could just remove all of my win conditions, because my inherent win condition is that I can't deck because I have Thwart Mystic Sanctuary, then that's great. So I inherently solved that problem that never really comes up anyway because the games are so fast. But I've just taken the Mystic Sanctuary technology that I've been working on ever since it first came out and just applying it to these new snowball engines. And here you go, new Miracles.
Yeah, I think something that's worth like kind of putting into perspective with this particular situation, Phil, is this means something. You're on this deck constantly. You know, you have played this deck inside and out like 1,000 different ways, right? And you know, we're in the group text together with Nate, and you know, it gets disheartening for me when like you chime in on like, you know, like at 9 o'clock on a Monday after the thing, and you're like, I'm 0-3, fuck this format, you know, like so
Yeah.
seeing a situation where you basically took the lessons you learned over the past few months and was like, all right, I'll buy in and see what happens. And you took this deck and you know, you've been working with it forever, and you pull a 4-0 out, and it's not like it's like oh well, like I got there with this 4-0. Like you have been engineering this the entire time to get to this point, and that to me, like, you know, we have the deck list. We'll give a quick shout out to Moxfield. We'll do the ad real fast.
Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
And now that we're back from the ad, you know, you've created you've been working on this list. You're literally the only person working in Miracles that I know of at this time. And you pull a 4-0 like that. If you pull a 4-0 at EU, you can expect to win the next 3 or 4 rounds too, I think.
Yeah, I think that like it's really interesting because I find that like I've been really down on the format because of the new cards and because of those the snowballing effects that like the games aren't all that, like, at least in those types of mirror matches where it becomes the snowball arms race. Those games were never they've never been interesting. I've never found them compelling because they always it really just becomes down to what I had mentioned before. It's the engines versus forceables, and like there's some amount of play versus the other matchups. But what I'm noticing is, even though it's like obviously it feels good to like win some games for the first time in however many years, right? Like it's definitely not a bad feeling to win, but it doesn't mean that I think that it's necessarily in a healthy place. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, you can have fun in the format and not think that the format is going in the correct direction. You know, like, you know, you can win, like, and also think that too, for sure.
I mean, yeah, it's like if somebody were to be like, Phil, do you think the format is healthy? I would say no. And I say that because I think that like it revolves around.
Well, that's
really
more of a state of the game health than it is a format, right?
Totally. I think it's like the stuff that the format, like the matchups, the games, the game pieces that the matchups revolve around as the pillars of the format and Legacy right now, I think personally are not healthy and are mostly uninteresting. But I think that like if we just we default to, yes, the pillars of the format are, you know, Beanstalk, Urza Saga, and Dark Ritual. Like, okay, like let's get over that hurdle because that's the world we live in. Cool.
Yeah.
Then from that point, you know, how do we actually find the positioning within that? And what I found was that the 4-color decks I feel like are clunky messes. And the reason for that is I can't tell you what the deck is trying to do other than slam cards and hope that they're good. So
yeah, if you were to look at it's tap out, it's classic like tap out control, which we, you know, it's been around since like 2005, right?
But it's tap out control in such a way where I go, what is the deck trying to do in the blind other than hope that its cards line up properly?
Yeah.
If you were to open your top 12 against your opponent's top 12, right? So like I can't
explain to me how that's different than Miracles, because I think that I mean if you were to say that in the blind, I'd say you're just explaining Miracles.
Beanstalk is the legacy power level thing to do. Therefore, I want Terminus. Therefore, I want Mystic Sanctuary.
Okay,
and that's it. You have your structure, right?
Yeah.
So I was playing 12 cantrips. I was playing Brainstorm Ponder and the full suite of Portent. And Portent is obviously good to turn on your Miracles. Like that's been the case ever since Top got banned. But the other part of it is like, you just want more. You want to be able to find your beans more routinely on turn 2. Like you want to slam your beans on turn 2, and then from that point, it's just exchange with your opponent because beans will bury them. So like, that's the whole game plan.
Are we talking about aggressively mulliganing to beans?
I think that if you have a reasonable hand with a cantrip, you can open turn one. If like, let's say you can get through your development, your lands in your development, and you have like maybe a removal spell or a force or something that you're relatively safe in the blind to think, okay, I'm not going to die. Your plan can still go, okay, turn one, I'm going to cantrip. I either find the Beanstalk or I find another cantrip to be able to go like, okay, prismatic ending or swords on turn two plus cantrip to try and find the beans to then keep going.
Yeah.
But like ideally you want to be able to set up your you want to get Beanstalk as fast as possible.
Yeah.
To the point where I was like, I remember when we talk about pre-modern, and there's been, at least in my conversations in pre-modern, ever since land tax got banned, Argothian Enchantress is still a really powerful draw engine in that format. And there's this always been this back and forth of like, do you play Worldly Tutor at the end of your opponent's turn so you can get your Argothian Enchantress and then slam it on turn two? And there's the argument, it's like, okay, well, if you have 8 Argothian Enchantresses in your deck, and that's your engine, and you expect to convert, 3+ cards off that engine, then is mulliganing for it via the Worldly Tutor an effective trade-off to ensure that you have the consistency of hitting it on turn two every time?
Yeah.
Because if you have 8 copies in your deck, the math is like 80 some odd % to open it, right?
Yeah.
So the argument of being like, is this engine powerful enough that I would would
you lose cards for it? Yeah. I think that's the important thing is we know we're drawing the cards, right? So if we know we're drawing the cards and we can reliably slam it on turn two, it's worth 1 or 2 cards to make sure we get that card, right?
I'm thinking to myself, if like in the world that I was built, I went very basic in my build. I didn't try and do anything fancy because I was just like, I'm going to see how Beanstalk goes in, my classic shell with what I have, which I know is good, and then see where that plays. And, it was obviously like super busted and overpowered and stupid. And I think that if you could play 6 to 8 Beanstalks in your Beanstalk focused deck, you would.
Yeah.
And I think that like the Yorion builds are playing the One Ring right now. They're playing, I think, like 3 copies probably. Maybe they're over the 4 at some point. But I've seen 3 copies pretty consistently. And in my mind, if those 3 rings could just be Beanstalks 5 through 7, they 100% would be. So like if you were to look at my Moxfield deck list, there are certain things that I made that I was like conscious about, like, here's how these matchups line up and why I think that the 4-color Yorion decks aren't, like, they're on Leyline binding and all of this stuff because they want to make beans more powerful, but they're not doing anything to reliably get themselves the beans on turn 2 or turn 3, because they're in 80 cards, they're on 8 cantrips, beyond the Beanstalks was cantrip, but like if you found it, great. But like in order to find it, you're on 80 cards and 8 cantrips. Like that's not going to get you there in a consistent way. So like that's what I mean by, if you're not, and so they're playing One Rings to compensate, but I feel like, it's just folding into this arms race without actually having a focused direction for what your deck wants to do. And then there's exploitable weaknesses that are pretty obvious within the shell. So 4-color, they're playing Leyline binding, and the difference between Leyline binding and prismatic ending?
Several mana.
Well, the advantages of Leyline binding is that it's 1 mana
an instant
for
speed
any
spell.
permanent at instant speed, for any non-land permanent at instant speed. But the difference is it leaves an enchantment on the table that can get blown up.
Yeah.
And if you remove anything that has any amount of value, you just get fucked, dude.
Yeah.
Like I was playing a really greedy mana base because I wanted to. I was already in Bant, and I didn't want to play any planes because I'm a Mystic Sanctuary deck. And every time you've ever played a planes with your Mystic Sanctuary, you just turn yourself off a whole turn cycle, and it just ain't it. You just don't want to be there. The format's way too fast to miss, essentially. Like, imagine when the idea of your opponent, it's like, you play the planes so they can't waste you.
And your land comes into play tapped as well. Like, come on.
If you play like a Triome or something, but if you play a basic planes, then it's like, okay, that is effectively like I have wastelanded myself.
Yeah.
In regards to Mystic Sanctuary, because if they cut you off getting to your 4th land drop for your Mystic Sanctuary through a wasteland, it's the same thing if you were play a basic planes. That Mystic Sanctuary is still off the table until a full turn cycle later. So it's like, yes, your development for your removal spells was maybe safe, but like I think the format is too fast, and there are too many snowball effects that let you recoup that card, that land drop that you, unless you're being locked out in some way of like some strip lock, then the trade-off is too steep to play a basic planes. So I didn't play any basic planes, and I was on mono islands all the way across the board. And what I played in the sideboard was a pair of Force of Vigors to deal with Blood Moon effects, right?
Yeah.
I'm just like, okay, I already have a bunch of green cards in my deck now because Beanstalk incentivizes you really to move much further into green. And I was like, okay, I'm going to play Force of Vigor as my nod to Blood Moon. The thing is that also means that you have another Haymaker against the Urza Saga decks, and you have another Haymaker that you bring in against opposing Bean decks, because you can't. It sucks to trade with Beans on a 1-for-1 basis because they recoup a card. But if you catch a Beans and a Leyline Binding or multiple Leyline Bindings, the game's fucking over.
Wait, a quick time out just for anybody watching this not on like the day that it comes out. Maybe you're watching this a couple months from now. I have the way Phil makes his decks on Moxfield is he live updates his deck. So definitely go down and follow Phil on Moxfield and check out the deck as it is today. But also on Eternal Durdles, I took this deck and duplicated it so it is as a moment in time. You can actually look at this particular deck as well. So if you're not seeing it on Phil's, you're going to definitely be able to see it on the Eternal Durdles account. So we got a better idea. That way you can follow along with us here. But Phil, one of the cards that I found fascinating that you were playing was Cosmic Rebirth.
Yeah, Cosmic Rebirth, there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is, I think, having incidental life gain somewhere in your deck is really powerful when it's recursive.
Especially, recursive. Yeah, that's a big thing.
Mystic Sanctuary being able to pick up a Cosmic Rebirth, and it's also... Cosmic Rebirth does incidentally a couple of things. Is it a lock to have to be in the deck? Not at all. But is it good? And I would say it's good if the incentive to be in green is strong enough, and the incentive is Beanstalk, right? The deck is a Beanstalk deck, so you're already in green, so it's negligible. What I like about it is that it's instant speed. So what it does is it on turn 3, you can hold up your mana for your removal, your Countermagic, whatever it may be, and you can instant speed back a fetch, and now you're at Mystic Sanctuary.
And you've basically
really
ramped, right? Like,
that's what I mean.
Yeah,
it gets you a turn ahead. So it essentially doing an Uro impression at instant speed in that spot is valuable in you have an engine going off your Beanstalk, and you're more likely to hit your land drops and be able to deploy more spells to 2-spell more aggressively anyway. And 2, because the end game of your deck is Entreat the Angels, and being able to get into Entreat range.
Land. Yeah.
And the critical target for Entreat is X equals 3, because that's a 5-mana spell for your Beanstalk.
Yeah.
And so your Entreat not only makes 3 angels but cantrips.
It also means that you're pretty much guaranteed a 2-turn clock at that point, which is the defining factor, right?
Yeah, I find that like the clock is usually less relevant because they sort of fold to the engine before they fold to the clock. Because before that would have been the case in Miracles of old, where you're trying to convert your card advantage in a way where there isn't that much card advantage in the format. And so
3 was
you're
the number
leveraging...
you like felt the least bad about doing as far as low numbers were concerned. Like ideally 5, right? Like ideally you're like you have 1 turn to live. 4 felt okay, especially in a fetch land economy. But 3 was kind of where you wanted to be able to hold up mana and know that like it doesn't change the amount of turns between a 4 and a 3, and then a 2 is almost always going to be that extra turn. So
yes, for anybody who has like an interest in control, at least this style of control, and I get we do a lot of episode on Miracles, so sorry for the people who aren't interested. The trajectory of the deck since Mystic Sanctuary is easily the most impactful printing for Miracles since Topps ban, like without a doubt. Mystic Sanctuary is the card. And what the deck was initially when Mystic Sanctuary came out, at least I did. I leaned harder into Entreat the Angels in that you were just trying to essentially machine gun Entreat the Angels, right? We're Entreat, Mystic Sanctuary for Entreat, Mystic Sanctuary Entreat. It just goes over the top of everything else in the format. And the first one, you exit for 3 or X for 4. They trade all of the removal spells in game 1 for your 1 Entreat. You put it back on top and you bury them. Game 2, that removal is usually has come out at that point, and a single Entreat that is fought over and won gets there. And if it doesn't, you just recur it with Mystic Sanctuary anyway. Yeah. Then once the format like sped up exponentially, and more people were on like Teferi Time Ravelers and stuff as like a mainstay in pretty much every deck. And then Miracling essentially was a liability because they had a static effect that turned that off. You're still very weak to Teferi Time Raveler. Like that hasn't changed at all.
Yeah.
But like the fact that you have an engine so you can more aggressively force it means that, you know, you recoup the cards so you're not totally behind all the time.
Not to
Anyway,
mention
like,
you're more reliably at X equals 3 for your prismatic ending too.
Yeah, we'll yeah, exactly. Yeah, prismatic ending becomes a bigger player in that space. But like, we'll talk about how Beanstalk has changed the paradigm, you know, entirely in a second. But like, so when Mystic Sanctuary first came out, it was Mystic 4 and Treat Machine Gun it. Then once the format sped up and Miracling was a liability, I moved back over to Jace the Mind Sculptor because then once you were back on and Jace is my like sole win condition. Because once you move over and you're like, okay, Mystic Sanctuary is the Terminus is the powerful thing to do, and therefore we want Mystic Sanctuary, and therefore we want Thwart, and like that became the shell where Mystic Sanctuary became the pinnacle piece that tied the room together. That's where like, okay, if you can Jace Thwart, pick up 3 islands to protect it, and now you can brainstorm, and now you have all this fodder for your brainstorm and the Jace, and now you can just protect the Jace because you have all this fodder to protect the Jace on the table, and you're still playing your Terminuses, and your Terminus keep the board clear. Your Jace ensures that like you're constantly going to be up on the perfect cards in hand to be able to deal with whatever the situation is, and then you can also close the door with your Portents and your Jace's Fate Sealing them. That's where the deck had like shifted to after Miracling became a liability as an endgame because it was too because Teferi and a bunch of other things, the format got too fast.
Yeah.
Then I tried a bunch of things. I moved back over to Counterbalance because I was like, the format is sped up. It's a little bit lower to the ground. People pick back Delver back up.
And it works with the Mystic Sanctuary, you know.
But then after I wrote, yes, I mean, obviously Counterbalance and Mystic Sanctuary is a shell in itself. But it requires that your opponent has to have agreed when they sat down at the table that their CMC value is going to be similar to what your deck is built around.
Exactly.
Which means that you're extremely polarizing, right? Like in a world
Spoiler
of Delver,
alert.
in a world of Delver, Counterbalance is the fucking jam. And Counterbalance still is like a 1 or 2 of in most Delver boards for the mirror and for combo, right? Like you are likely to see Counterbalance in some numbers still to this day in those kinds of decks.
If
and I was
playing
them.
you.
Well, if you play against Delver, you're going to see 1 or 2 of in a wide variety of shells.
Oh, okay.
You know, I mean, you know, not every pilot's going to have it. You know, Counterbalance isn't the easiest card to play with, but you know, there's enough manipulation in that deck, especially when you're playing a mirror and you know that you're at the similar CMC values, where it's like if you can just have this lock piece on the table, then your opponent has to like dance around it.
It's actually doing kind of a negative version of Beanstalk in a Delver deck, right? Like it's the same but different.
The problem, so Counterbalance is really good when your opponent doesn't have an engine. So in the worlds where there were no engines, or the engine is easily shucked off by Counterbalance being on the table, looking at you expressive iteration, that, you know, okay, it's not as difficult to stop your opponents. So after that, then 40K comes out.
Yeah.
St. Catherine changes the paradigm again. So now we have Mystic Sanctuary changes Miracles, Triumph of St. Catherine changes the Miracles, because Triumph came out when Expressive Iteration was still in the format and Blue-Red Delver was everywhere. Blue-Red Delver was the deck, right? And I was the 4X Triumph of St. Catherine gamer. I made, I think, my best parity based on that card. And if you had told me that I could go into any event when Blue-Red Delver with Expressive Iteration was top dog and just play against it 15 rounds in a row with my 4X Triumph of St. Catherine in the main, I would have slammed it immediately. I would have said, yes, please, give me that matchup. Because Triumph was such a haymaker that it just blew that matchup out. It didn't matter how many cards you drew. You weren't dealing with this fucking Baneslayer Angel. But then Lord of the Rings comes out.
Yeah.
All these black cards move Delver and all these other decks into Grief and Bowmasters and Troll of Khazad-dûm, and that's even before we get to the space where Snuff Out was being played as a way to deal with opposing Murktides. So now that Expressive Iteration is banned and players are, you know, have these free slots to expand their suites, those suites end up being really good against Triumph, and Triumph is no longer the 10 value haymaker that it was. And so I moved to Triumph to the board for a really long time. And then I was like, okay, Miracles is dead. There's just nothing to keep up with this stuff. Like, I need a new printing. I need something that can keep up with these cards. And now we have Beanstalk. And, you know, Beanstalk, it's not the hero I wanted, but it seems to be the hero, the hero we got. I wanted, maybe another brainstorm type effect that did something, or another kind of miracle that helped us out. But Beanstalk is the space.
Beanstalk's over the corner like, I am vengeance.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like, I feel invigorated that there is space for the kind of miracles that I like to play to exist again.
Yeah.
But I really hate that it's on the backbone of this card that is, it's just like, it doesn't excite me.
Yeah.
Because it's just every game becomes about it.
Well, take your wins and you hush.
Yeah. I get there's back and forth, but here's the thing, man. Like, I think like if I'm representative of anybody else who has been sort of soured on Legacy, and I still don't think the format's in a healthy place. I don't know if it's ever going to go back to a healthy place in my view of what it of a time where it wasn't just these commander product snowballs or these power creep snowballs. Like I have always enjoyed positional gameplay, and I find that is much less so when these engines are so effective and so cheap. And the games that just become about those engines are way less interesting. But I think there's also something to be said. It's like, okay, well, if the interest shifts from being like, okay, if we just have to accept that by default and, learn to grow into, okay, then how do we then manipulate around these engines if this is the gameplay? I'm still, trying to find the avenue around that. But I can say that, like, the stuff that did become interesting was stuff like Force of Vigor, using that as a way to like check the 4-color matchup, because the leyline binding in my mind for them is a liability. Looking at the space where the sideboard cards can cross over across the format. Oh, we were talking about Cosmic Rebirth. So that was the trajectory of miracles. We'll talk about Beanstalk in a second. So Cosmic Rebirth in particular, I have it because it's main deck incidental life gain. If you play a Beanstalk, it is correct for your opponent to fight over it. If I cast the Beanstalk on 2, or if your opponent casts a Beanstalk on 2, if you don't have an immediate follow-up removal spell to go down a card, knowing that maybe you can recoup the card with your own engine in a later turn, if you don't have it immediately, then you are correct to fight over it. Yeah. And if you're correct to fight over it, then I want more copies of it.
Yeah. So that's where the Cosmic Rebirth comes into play.
Cosmic Rebirth can pick that up. The other side of it is I was playing 2 main deck Dress Down, and Dress Down going away, Dress Down the other pillar in the format, in my view, Urza Saga. I think that like you have to have some amount of you have to respect Urza Saga like as a baseline.
Yeah.
Like you can't be blind to Urza Saga. I think that like Terminus is not necessarily reliable as a way to solve a turn play against a turn 1 side. Like if you and I are playing against each other, right? You're the ACAS guy, and you go Saga on 1, right? It is unreliable that I'm going to have a Terminus in time before I get chunked for 9.
Yeah, you're gonna get hit a couple times, probably, and possibly then lose the game if you can't set it up quick enough.
If I can't set it up quick enough, and then even if I do, if you just force it and I don't have a way to fight back, I just die right there, right? Yeah. From your turn 1 play that cost you that was uncounterable. So it's like you have to respect Urza Saga if you're playing these kinds of decks.
A little bit more ways to stop that from becoming a thing that you lose to.
Yeah. So I was playing 2 Dress Downs. Dress Down obviously goes away by itself. So Cosmic Rebirth represents, with Mystic Sanctuary and Thwart, an infinite number of Dress Downs.
Yeah.
So there's value in that. Then also post board, I have the Counterbalance package because, as we had mentioned before, Counterbalance is a 10-2 card, similar to where Triumph is. Triumph was also in my board. And if you have a certain number of 3s, I was playing 2 Force of Negation. This is the reason why I really love Counterbalance and building around it is figuring out mana value spreads in the matchups that you want it against as a metagame shifts. Yeah. And so if you look at my main deck, I'm not on a lot of 2s. I'm on 7 main deck 2s, right? I'm on 4 Beanstalk, 2 Dress Down, 1 Life from the Loam. And the Life from the Loam is just a nod because my mana base is fucking trash. So, but post board, if you know that you're going to bring in your counterbalances and then any number of the 2s that are in the board, given the matchup, like if I'm bringing in, bringing Counterbalance in against combo, then I'm going to also want like the Null Rod. I'm going to want, maybe the Sabo's Web, depending if they have like some kind of Caracas Loop or something like that. So depending on the other 2s you bring in, and now you're way more dense at 2 post board with your counterbalancers because your counterbalancers represent 2 themselves.
Yeah.
So like there's space in that. The other side is that with if you have, let's say you go turn 2 counterbalance, untap, holding up Cosmic Rebirth. Cosmic Rebirth represents a Mystic Sanctuary with a fetch in your yard.
Yeah.
And what that means is that not only does it represent a Mystic Sanctuary on 3 mana for any card in your graveyard, it also de facto represents a 3 because the Cosmic Rebirth will have resolved, been in your yard, you can fetch Mystic Sanctuary, put it back on top, counter 3-drop. So that is 3 mana for 3 mana. It's a 3 mana trade, but you do go up the land in the exchange, so now you're already on Mystic Sanctuary, in which case you should be in position with that Cosmic Rebirth coming off the top, representing that same fetch that you just had, representing another Mystic Sanctuary, in which case the loop continues.
And 6 life.
And 6 life.
Yeah.
So there's something to be said there. There's enough incidental stuff with Cosmic Rebirth that it's doing that the like if they give me better incidental life gain on an instant or sorcery in the future that does something more than what Cosmic Rebirth does, I'm not married to Cosmic Rebirth. It's just filling a very, very, very specific thing.
It's got a niche.
I want somewhere in my 75 that's not Triumph of St. Catherine to have incidental life gain. Triumph of St. Catherine's a plan. Like when you board that in, you're like, this is the thing that's, they should have a problem dealing with.
I'm on this, yeah.
And if they don't have a problem dealing with Triumph, I don't board it in.
What decks right now have a problem with Triumph though? Delver. Just Grixis. Just like Grixis. Do you think Grixis is the deck? I can see Temur Delver really having a problem with it because I can't.
Yes.
Back in the day, I could not remove a 5/5 from the board. That was a problem. But Grixis is, I guess, not playing as many snuff out situations, or they've got Fatal Push, but that's obviously not going to do it.
It doesn't work. Yeah. So snuff out has fallen out of favor, but I'll say the reason for Triumph coming in and being very good against Delver is a couple of reasons. A, Delver decks care about your life total.
Yeah.
As a baseline, they care about life total. B, they're not a Swords to Plowshares deck.
Exactly.
I'm not boarding Triumph in against any Swords to Plowshare deck.
I guess snuff it out. I'll just get it back, right? Yeah.
If you're initiative, if you're D&T, if you're 4-color, I'm not boarding Triumph in against you, unless you show absolutely no respect at all and have boarded out all your removal. I'm not boarding it in.
Yeah.
But I do want it against a couple of things. So I want it against Delver variants or anything that cares about life total. And then the other thing that I wanted it against is decks where you're going to be on a lower resource gain. So same thing, if Delver's going to wasteland you, I don't want to be on Entreat that needs a developed base. I can Miracle for 2. But the other thing that I want it for is fast combo. I'm happy to board out my Entreat the Angels for my Triumph, because now I have a 5/5 lifelinker that's good against that is going to build up your storm count.
Yeah.
Like you're going to need a higher storm count, and it's reliable to like get in a clock on 2 as opposed to having to wait to develop and then hit an Entreat, because yes, you can one-shot Entreat, but if you have to tap out to do it, it's not necessarily safe.
Yeah, I suppose like your turn 1 play, Brainstorm or Ponder, Portent, whatever. Turn 2, I guess it's turn 3 would be Triumph. And then just be like, okay, well, you're on Storm. I'm going to have interaction and I'll play this, this 2-drop that just basically adds 2 to Storm every turn.
Yeah, it essentially says like when you're thinking about like what your threats are, and I imagine that it's similar for when you're navigating how to board with ACAST. When you're thinking like what are the actual potent threats, like how does the matchup actually line up? If you're playing a 4-color-ish control deck versus combo, what cards are gonna you can't tap out for something that's not either at instant speed or doing something that like relevantly disrupts them in some meaningful way. Like if you play. If you tapped out for Minsk in your 4-color deck against combo, that was probably bad, because they'll be like, great, I take 4, I untap and kill you.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if you play the Ring, it's like, okay, I have protection. They can't kill me unless they have some kind of obscure sideboard card that I can't play around, and I will at least get to untap, having Ancestral, and now I can hold up my resources, and I'm just going to bury them under cards, right? Like, that's where the paradigm shifts, and that's why like Minsk has fallen off the face of the earth in place of One Ring, because One Ring can actually like save yourself when you're tapped out, and the impetus to be able to fight over opposing planeswalkers is been nullified to an extent because you have leyline bindings. So from that perspective, they have like shifted their game a little bit in order to like hedge that sort of thing. And that's what I mean. You have to be in the arms race. Anyway, not to lose the thread here.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking like, how does this matchup actually play out? It's like, I'm never going to, if I develop to the point where I have an entreat against the combo deck, I've won that game.
Yeah.
You know? So I'd rather just like have the cheaper effect that can kill them, because killing them is very rarely, when you're playing control against combo, do you win because you killed the combo deck. You won because you stopped the combo deck.
Yeah.
Right? It's usually how it goes. And that's why it's like, you know, on your end, it's like Delver matchups. Delver players will board out their Murktides against combo.
Yeah.
Murktide's too slow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
it's too slow. You're like, I'm going to play a 1-drop. You're not going to remove it. And then we just fight over the thing until this thing gets you dead. Right? Like, that's how you, and it's the same thing, right? Like, you just have to know how to line up choices. So, you know, long-winded way to get around Cosmic Rebirth, and now Triumph of St. Catherine to the board, counterbalance the board. The other card that I think is people are sleeping on is the way that the format has shifted in its entirety because of these new snowballs, right? So in the way where Beanstalk changes the paradigm, the games become about who has the engine, and then the other side of that coin is who has more force effects to fight over that engine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I agree.
Gone are the days of being able to hold up mana for Countermagic. You don't have time. There is no time for Spell Pierce. There is no time for any Countermagic that costs mana. There is no time. You do not have the luxury of time. The format's way too fast. So you have to play. So like, you will see more and more lists as they come out in challenges and whatnot. 4 Force of Will main deck, some amount of Force of Negation main deck, and then probably the 3rd or 4th Force of Negation in the board. Across every deck that can play Force of Wills. Whether it's 4-color Yorion, whether it's A-Cast, you're just going to see a whole shitload of forces.
It's not just for Yorion piles anymore. Six plus force effects.
6+ force effects, and it's because you need to have it, like, Beseech also has changed the metric, where like fast combo decks can also go off on way lower resources now. And a lot of those combo decks also have Urza Saga. So if you are compelled to use your mana to not die to 9/9s that are uncounterable, then you can't spend your mana Schadenporting yourself, hoping that they walk into a Pierce, right? That world is long gone. You can throw those cards away. They're not coming back unless something, you know, somehow wildly changes the paradigm. And Saga gets banned, and Beanstalk goes, and all this stuff shifts again.
Yeah.
Like, you get rid of that stuff. And with all that stuff goes a lot of the cards that would usually be good with that stuff. So like, if you're playing Fluster, I mean, I was high on Fluster Snapcaster for a while. I was like, this is sweet. Against Expressive Iteration, nothing feels better than when they go Expressive Iteration because they want to hit their land drop that they didn't play their land drop yet, and then you Fluster, and they're like, oh, well, this feels awkward, play my land afterwards, and you're like, yeah, gotcha, idiot. And then you're like, all right, next turn, play another Expressive, and you're like, yeah, snap Fluster that, you idiot, like, you're dumb. And then if they're like, all right, Mystic Sanctuary this thing back, and it's like, sweet, dude, predict that off the top, like, you're a clown. Like, these things feel good, right?
Yeah.
But gone are those days, Zach.
They
gone.
are. Yeah.
So, but like, also, it's like, if you want to play Fluster, that's all well and good, but Beseech has made people move into stuff that you can't Fluster.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be able to fight over Carpet of Flowers, and Carpet of Flowers is going to be everywhere in the Beseech decks. And if they play a Carpet of Flowers, and you're looking at that Fluster Storm in your hand, and then they're like, all right,
well, I have 15 mana.
Carpet, make a bunch of mana, Beseech my Carpet, that, you know, for free off of the Carpet mana, and you're like, all right, well, I guess I could Fluster, and they can just pay for all the copies because I couldn't fight over the Carpet of Flowers. Now we're just you're on the wrong axis. You're on the wrong axis, and then your opponents in your 4-color mirrors, you're going to bring Fluster in. Like, you think Pyroblast is good in this format? No, get your Pyroblast out of your sideboard. Those things suck now, right? Like, the stuff is way too wide. Pyroblast, you can't bring it against any reasonable combo deck. I mean, if you do, they're prepared to fight over it because they have a bunch of silence effects in their shit. Like, Veil is going to blow you out. And you get that stuff out of here. You can't be doing that anymore. The reason that Veil of Summer still gets played is because you can proactively use it as a silence.
Yeah.
You know? Or you can catch your opponent, like, you can protect your opponent from being able to tendrils kill you. Like, it has and it cantrips. Fucking cantrips. Like, it has not only this utility against everything else in the format, but it also cantrips, and you can use it proactively.
It's like a 1-mana abeyance.
Like, yes, like that is maybe the one that gets the nod in your not combo deck, because it has all of these other utilities of, like, okay, if you're playing it and your opponent has a chalice on whatever, and it's not one, you can like play your stuff through the chalice. Like, it has so much more utility beyond just a counter spell. Your Pierce does not anymore. Your spell snares or whatever, get it out. So, but that being said, free counter magic is a premium. And I think people are sleeping on Mindbreak Trap, and there's 2 reasons for that.
Okay.
2 reasons for
Tell me.
Mindbreak Trap,
Yeah.
I think, being in decks beyond just the decks that don't have counter magic. One is you incidentally need to have a higher volume of ways to deal with Storm.
Sure.
They got a tool that brought their
Hard
resources
agree.
way down.
Yeah.
Right? If they have a tool that means they can go off on lower resources, then you need to have more tools that can stop it at lower resources. If we're going to keep getting these more and more powerful tools, if we're going to keep inching closer and closer to vintage power level, then you have to like start fighting on the same axes, and you can't be relying on thinking you're going to get some amount of development in. You're not. The second thing is Mindbreak Trap in the control mirrors that go really long. Guess what? If the world becomes about who has more engines and then who has more force of wills to stop those engines, then you know what's really powerful? Just more counter magic. More of it.
Yeah.
You just need more. And it's really powerful in when your opponent can go like 4th plus Mystic Sanctuary and 4th again to exile. And then if you ever get into a counter war deep into the game and then blow somebody out, feels great.
Yeah.
The other thing to be said about Mindbreak Trap in this instance, what we were talking about before of how the format has split 4-color in the arms race against itself versus how much it's willing to concede to fast combo in Urza Saga decks, right? Like that is in my view, that is the definitive split of the format right now. You're either bowmastering somewhere in the middle of the space, in which case you're doing like you're doing a bunch of incidental value things.
Yeah.
Hello, D&T players and whatnot, right?
Sure.
You're doing the Delver space where you're on like Bowmasters and then your Days Wasteland shell as per usual. And also, I want to point out that when we were talking about Infect with Fenrir's Cloud, and we're like, yeah, Legolas's quick reflexes is going to like overhaul Infect, and that's going to be sweet. And I would argue that Infect, as we've talked about before, indistinguishable from a combo, right?
Yeah,
yes, it's an aggro deck.
100%.
Yes, it's of course. Yes, of course. Zach says, of course. You know what else is? Fucking Delver. Delver, in my view, is indistinguishable from combo, similar to Infect nowadays, because this is why. I'll argue the point.
Please elaborate.
The same way that your like Infect goes Delver Days, or not Delver Days, cheap threat Days in order to kill, right? And then plays some amount of disruption in Force of Will and Days. So does Delver, but because it has Murktide is a 1-turn clock. So you can play a disruption game, cast a Murktide, and kill in a shot, and that makes it, in my view, indistinguishable from combo in terms of how you can navigate a game. Now, granted, their combo is disrupted by removal spells, and that might make it feel different. Yeah. But in terms of actually how the games play out and what matters, it's indistinguishable. Now, if we're in those spaces, you have Orcish Bowmaster hovering somewhere in the middle, and Orcish Bowmaster also means that it's paired with Wasteland, so you're some kind of Orcish Bowmaster disruptive shell, or you're in like the more combo-centric area of like, okay, we're on some form of Beseech deck, whether that's Storm Combo, Mono Black Helm, whatever it is. It effectively means I'm on either Veil of Summer or discard spells plus Beseech to kill you. Great. Sure. Choose whatever you want on the back end of the Beseech to kill, whether it's Gaia's Will or a Helm. Cool. Whatever that, are you a more mid-rangey Dark Ritual player, or are you a more stack-based Ritual player? You're a Dark Ritual player. So those are hovering somewhere in the spectrum here. But then otherwise you have like the fast side, which is actually the Dark Ritual fast combo. And then you have the hard, like deep side of 4-color control. If that's what matters, then it means that it's engine-based and Force of Wills are the things that matter. And that means that if we're in the space where more Force of Will and free effects matter, then Mindbreak Trap stock goes way up.
Yeah, there's the bridge. There's the bridge.
There's the bridge. there's the bridge when you need something. And then like incidentally it having, crossover against like other combo shells or, other things where like having an exile effect is really important. Like in the snowbally games where the games go long because you're just fighting over engines and both players have a bajillion cards. Yeah, it's going to feel really good when if we both board in all of our forces because we have to fight over all these engines, then it's like, okay, if I have, 6 to 8 Force of Will effects, and then I also have a Mindbreak Trap or 2, and then I also have Force of Vigor, and I can keep, tapping out for all of my engines, and I have more forces than you. I have won the arms race, right?
Sure.
And that's when you pare it all down. That's the arms race. It just so happens that Mindbreak Trap gets to bridge the gap between both of the like wide fast combo versus the
control style decks,
the 4-color arms races. So those are the reasons for my current choices. There's still stuff up in the air, but like I think that like all of the shells that I look at right now, it's like either they feel unfocused or they feel as though they don't have a quite as firm of a grasp in their card choices of what at least I think the format is right now, you know. And it's like Bowmaster Wasteland, Urza Saga, Dark Ritual, and then the arms race of 4-color plus control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that kind of does it for the points we wanted to make. I think the real proof in the pudding moment will be how you pull off next week. You know, now that people have seen this, will you be able to just continue snowballing them?
Yeah, I think that like it is to like.
I mean, no one's surprised, right? No one sits down against you and is like, "Oh, you're playing Miracles? I had no idea."
Yeah, I would say that the TLDR of this episode isn't necessarily like the, you know, metagame breakdown or what I think of the metagame. Like, I'm just one dude. It's my perspective through a very specific lens, like, you know, grain of salt, everything I say. But I think that the one thing to think about is if you are on a deck in particular, know what pillar you fall into, and then know how that pillar is supposed to line up against everything else to inform your sideboard choices. So like, if you're like, okay, I'm a painter deck, and therefore I want these tools against these things, or I'm an 8-cast deck, and therefore I want these tools against these things. You know, I found thinking back to when Fenris was on the cast, and I remember he was talking about his old sideboard that was 15 one-ofs. And we loved the idea of 15 one-ofs.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we are in a world where 15 one-ofs is ever going to make sense anymore, because the format is so fast. It like in terms like, and when I say fast, I mean like literally Dark Ritual Beseech kills you, or an engine buries you, and so you are effectively dead before you get your feet under you.
Well, Phil, I think also it's not just that it's fast; it's also homogenized.
Yes, I'm saying that like I think gone are.
That's why like no 15 one-ofs. Like you have to you have specific decks you have to answer. When we were rocking 15 one-ofs, it was because the metagame was kind of wide open.
Yes, that's where it's like I think that in the last year, with the printing of Lord of the Rings and the edition, like, and how it pairs with Modern Horizons, that the Legacy has taken a significant shift towards what I would imagine players who play Vintage view the format through, which is when you're looking at the format, there are very clearly distinct pillars.
Yeah, there are like 3 or 4 decks
that are far away and better than everything else, right? Like, you need to be prepared for shops. You need to be prepared for Bazaar. You probably need to be prepared for some amount of PO fast stack combo, maybe Tinker.
Yeah.
And then
you have to, like big blue or blue, like, you know, blue.
And then you have Xerox. Some amount of blue control, right? Yeah. And then maybe you could argue at this point that like initiative is somewhere in that space as well. But like, sure. But like, what that means though is in your board, you're like, okay, I'm 6 to 8 graveyard effects for Bazaar. I'm, you know, X number of hate pieces for Mishra's Workshop, and like it's that's it.
And hopefully
right?
some of that stuff overlaps, right? Like that's,
and hopefully some of it overlaps, but like, that's it, right? Like, so you look at sideboards and you're like, yep, 4 of this, 3 of this, 3 of this. That's your whole sideboard.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a space that's way closer to that than we are to being like, is this going to line up well? Does this work? It's like you need broad strokes, and your broad strokes have to cross over. And knowing what those pillars are in the broad strokes, and it's like, okay, well, there's a certain amount of crossover these days, right? Yeah. Beseech means that your Beseech incentivizes artifacts and enchantments. Beanstalk, that is the backbone of all these control decks, is an enchantment. Urza Saga is an enchantment. All of these decks are somehow based around artifacts and enchantments, and really powerful fast effects on the stack. And you need to be able to like stop that either on the stack via more force effects, or you need to have big blowout effects like Force of Vigor to stop the stuff that gets their engines going.
Yeah.
And I think have like just representing more of that as like your hammers out of the board is really where the format's going to have to shift. So like as people look at like their own stuff, like recognize the pillar that you're in, because if you can just clearly identify the pillar that you're in, if everybody is on that level, then knowing how to either play around that pillar or go over the top of those things that they're going to board in against the pillar that you're in, that's where I think you can get some edge beyond just like, let's turn our top 11 cards over.
Yeah.
You know.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
that does it for this week. We'll be on next week to see how Phil does. To that end, about being invigorated, we also have the Fenris Cloud Infect deck tech coming up really soon. I'm working on that today, so hopefully that'll be up within the week. And we've got a couple of other really great deck techs coming up as well. Stress Daddy's putting one together for us. Dukes is putting one together for us. We have I think 3 or 4 other ones in the works as well. So I'm very excited about these deck techs. And we've got a bunch of like cool shorts coming up, and that big long. If you've been answering our questions on the community part of the YouTube page about the most powerful cards each year, that is going to eventually become a like long 30-minute like super highly edited film that we're doing, sort of on the like Ristic study style. So yeah, stick around for that stuff, and like, subscribe, share, comment, all that stuff. Anyhow, thanks everybody for showing up, and we'll check in next week.
Thanks for watching. If you have the means to support the channel, please check us out on Patreon and check out this next video. It's pretty great.